Hey there, everyone. This is Ethan Melville, and I am talking to you guys today as part of Communications 295 here at Eastern Oregon University. This is for Professor Anderson's class, Communication Theory. We were tasked with taking a look at a communications theory that we had not gone over as a class for the duration of our term together. And so after taking a look at the book, it did not take me very long to find a theory that I believed was going to catch my interest. With a background in studying gender roles in history, I felt that studying gender and communication would be something that naturally would very much interest me, and I was correct in my assumption there. I think this is a very interesting theory that we're going to be talking about today, and so I hope you guys have fun with me on this presentation. We can get into that real quick. So we're going to be taking a look at the theory Genderlect Styles. And again, this is for 295. Thank you guys for tuning in. I really, really appreciate it. Apologies there. So gender and its impact on communication. So this theory, Genderlect Styles, was developed by Professor Deborah Tannen, who I believe is a professor at Georgetown University. This theory, I believe, was developed and really fleshed out in the 1990s. She published a book that discussed a lot of these concepts called You Just Don't Understand, which was very, very well received by, I believe, both the public and other communication scholars. The concepts that she discusses stem from the core contention that miscommunication often occurs between men and women, similarly to intercultural communication. And so that's typically when we think of two different cultures struggling to fully understand each other and using communication in different ways to achieve different things. We definitely think geographically of people separated by distance with distinct cultures who struggle to take the experiences that they have from their culture and to fully understand others. And Tannen contends that a similar experience happens when men and women communicate as well. So she labels this as cross-cultural, and that is the basis of her theory for explaining what she thinks is going on here when men and women struggle to communicate effectively with each other. Some phrases here that definitely stood out to me when looking at our textbook here when they were covering her book. Different words from different worlds, and then tuned to different frequencies, which heavily suggests, which definitely suggests that this behavior, these communication strategies are picked up on from a young age for both men and for women. That this is something that is learned from a young age, and that they are essentially tuned from that age to think about communication in different ways to achieve different things. While the book does explain that Genderlect was not coined by the professor, I definitely think that it was a very good word to attribute to this theory, as I think it really succinctly explains, according to her theory, what is going on here. And there are critiques of the theory that we will definitely take a look at together after diving into this a little bit more. But I think that it is overall pretty well described through Genderlect as a theory of miscommunication between genders. Tannen's assertions built upon, again, this tuning to different frequencies of men and women extends on to essentially men and women communicating to achieve different things. Women communicate to build rapport among others, which is to create and to maintain relationships, while men communicate to report, which could be to communicate about problems and to then solve problems. But at its core, the thing that men and women are trying to achieve is different. For men, that being status, and for women, that being connection with others. So when men communicate, yes, attracting attention to themselves, making their ideas known, asserting themselves. These are all things that are used to claim status for themselves, and to bring attention to themselves and to establish them as important within a hierarchical system, where women are more trained to go about using empathy and sensitivity to others in order to create and maintain relationships. And so Tannen argues that men and women are better trained to do specific, to achieve specific goals through their communication strategies. The strategies look very different in the public versus the private arena, or the sphere, of communication. Men speak more in the public arena and are more comfortable and willing to assert themselves. They can use things like interrupting others as strategic tools with which to elevate their status and to make sure that their ideas are made public, and to, again, build themselves up as important within a hierarchical system. This even extends, according to Tannen, to things like storytelling and joking. These are, again, tools in a man's toolkit, communication toolkit, to elevate themselves. Storytelling takes on a one-upsmanship kind of feel to it in this kind of communication, again, as a way of building yourself up. For women, you'll see things like cooperative overlap, tagging questions as well, to both show empathy to others and to prompt communication with others that builds deeper understandings and stronger relationships to others. So, building rapport by seeking input from others, basically. Tannen also asserts that because men and women understand communication differently and use it to achieve different goals, use different strategies, that the root of conflict in cross-gender communication stems from these differences. Men being more comfortable to engage in conflict in the communication setting versus women. Similarly, being resistant to change their behavior. There is, I believe, the example used of when Harry met Sally in our textbook, where Sally is trying to control and mitigate the conflict that Harry is engaging with, I believe, with her friends. To most women, conflict is a threat to connection to be avoided at all costs, and thus, according to this theory, Sally is attempting to prevent future conflict and to thus change the behavior of Harry, who is very resistant to this. Sally, in the meanwhile, because of this conflict, feels as though the relationships that she has built and is attempting to maintain both with her friends and with her significant other are threatened. The places in which the spheres in which men and women learn these different communication strategies and concepts are identified as speech communities. I have as an example here off to the side some general stereotypes about men and women that I think, again, really succinctly ascribe these ideals to men and women according to this theory. That men and women from a very young age, as boys and girls, are essentially segregated in two different communication or speech communities, where they learn strategies largely influenced by their parents. And so there's some examples how men and their young boys learn these strategies from both their mothers and from their fathers. That boys learn not to they learn to use communication as a way to enact control over others and to assert themselves and their authority, where women, or young girls, are more encouraged to use from an early age communication to build connections. Now, this is obviously not universal, and Tannen admits this as well, that there are instances of, say, a girl who maybe is more close to her father growing up than to her mother. She is more likely to pick up on the communication strategies of her father, which would lead to her being more comfortable asserting herself and engaging in communication in a masculine sphere, and using those tactics, while similarly struggling to build connections with friends who are girls, let's say. So there are some problems with this theory that, again, I think we'll start getting into in a second. But we can move on here for a second. I would like to use the fighting games community as an example of this. Being a nerd, I really enjoy whenever I can taking these courses and trying to tie them into communities and things that I'm very much invested in already. And so I think it was very interesting while I was reading this chapter here, I identified this theory as maybe going a little ways to help explain why in this community specifically, but in general, male-centric communities, why women may face problems entering them, and why they may feel alienated, and why they may struggle to feel fully accepted in these communities. If there's a community with a culture that's developed primarily by men, that community would be hierarchical in nature, and you would see communication used as a way of asserting yourself, claiming status, and being, very competitive in nature. And that definitely reflected by the fighting games community, because at its core, it is a group of people who compete against each other. So there are, this definitely, would go a long way to show why women may feel unwelcome by a community that has things like gatekeepers who may identify their role as protecting both their personal but also the community's status as well. But as we start to look at some critiques of this theory, I think it's definitely worth taking a note of the fact that this is definitely a very one-dimensional observation of this community, and then by extension of the individuals who are a part of that community. This theory, I think, can be critiqued or criticized as a little too absolute in its understanding of how men and women perceive communication. And I also think that this runs the risk of, and I've seen examples of this online, of rationalizing male exclusion of women from male-centric communities. And so someone who took a look at this theory may kind of understand it, even if they haven't been exposed to the actual theory itself. They may say things like, well, what do you expect? This is just the way things are. This is just, the way we communicate with each other. You got to learn to deal with it. And that is something that women deal with in the online setting and in person at events that bring this community together. And I think we should definitely be wary of any kind of theory that is very absolute in its understanding of differences between men and women, because as we move on, we'll see that there are more similarities between the genders than not, and there's obviously more differences between groups of men than there are with women. So again, when we move on to some critiques of the theory, the first one brought up in our textbook is the aha factor, which is a very good way of describing that this theory relies very heavily on subjective and anecdotal evidence to back it up. The aha factor is the feeling that one gets when they're reading this book. And I think that the editors of our textbook were actually very smart in the way that they decided to structure this chapter, because they front load the theory to you, obviously, at the beginning of the chapter. And I think you would be hard pressed to find someone who could read this chapter and not kind of have that, oh, that makes sense, that aha factor, through subjective experience and things like that. But men and women are not one-dimensional in their behavior, for sure, and they are not, obviously entirely segregated from each other from a young age as far as the ways in which they learn to communicate and why. So the textbook does point out in the section that it's laying out these critiques that most gender researchers spot more diversity within each gender than between them, which is a really important rebuttal to make to this theory, and definitely something that if you were to take away anything from this presentation, that's what I think I would like it to be. Feminist scholars similarly responded relatively negatively to this theory because it definitely paints there's a lack of critical analysis of how men engage in communication with women. It very much seems like it is skirting the line of almost justifying communication that seeks to disenfranchise women from it seeks to disenfranchise them in communication situations where the power dynamic is shifted, obviously, in men's favor. And so a lot of people were not super pleased to see a theory that would almost sort of suggest that this is just the way men and women are. Tannen was very optimistic, though, that men and women could learn more. They could learn to better communicate if they learned more about how the other gender communicates. And so she was optimistic that while currently in society there are a lot of miscommunications that occur between men and women, that it could get better, and that a factor of that would be hearing less and less of the phrase "you just don't understand." But again, we go back to this being very subjective, very anecdotal. Before wrapping up, I would just like to again say that yes, this was from our textbook, A First Look at Communications Theory, Genderlect Styles. I think it was a very interesting theory for sure. I very much liked learning about this. It was very, I think, informative, but it was almost kind of scary to me personally how it made a lot of sense until the editors brought up the critiques of this theory, where, again, I think very convincingly show that there are some serious flaws with the theory. And that, for me personally, the chief one being that men and women are not one-dimensional. Even going back to my example with the fighting games community, yes, it is a very competitive environment, but at its core, in addition to competing with one another, the two central goals of that community are competing, but connecting with others and building a community. And so men certainly do communicate with each other to build, connections, to build relationships as well. And, women don't only communicate to build relationships. They definitely, can and should, use communication to assert themselves as well, especially into communities that are traditionally male-centric. And they are certainly possible, that is certainly possible. Communities, I think, that engage in that kind of gatekeeping definitely need to reevaluate the ways that they communicate with women. So I want to thank you guys for listening to my presentation. I hope I covered everything. If you guys have any questions, you guys can email me at my email. I'll leave that in the description of the YouTube video here. I want to thank you guys for taking the time to listen to this. I really enjoyed studying this. Gender is something that is a particular interest to me. I study gender roles in history, primarily as part of my history major, and thus finding ways to look at the nuance that gender plays in the ways we communicate has been the most exciting part of my time studying communications as a minor. And so I'm hoping to continue to do that as well and to build a better understanding of that moving forward towards graduation. So I want to thank you guys again, and I hope you guys have a good rest of your term. Best of luck to everyone on finals, and we'll see you guys in the spring.